All right, let's get into our panel discussion for this evening. And of course, we review the week that was. The ANC is vowed to root out corrupt members and those involved in factional politics. That was during its 113th birthday celebrations. ANC President Cyril Ramaphosa told supporters in Khayelitsha that the party aims to urgently implement its renewal agenda this year. Meanwhile, the Democratic Alliance has come under fire regarding the use of blue lights by its ministers in the Government of National Unity. There's a lot more stories as well that made headlines in the week that was. And to talk us through some of them, we are joined by Mail and Guardian Director, Mr. Thembisa Fakude, who also is a Senior Research Fellow with Africa-Asia Dialogues. And we're also joined via video link by political analyst Sanet Madonsela-Solomon. Sanet, good evening to you. Thembisa, good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I want to start with you, Thembisa, because I think that what happens is we have quite an interesting situation in South Africa where as we begin the year, there's also almost immediately a political sort of agenda that's set where before we even, sort of plan what's going to happen much further on into the year, we know that at the beginning in the newsrooms that we're starting with January 8. And there was certainly going to be a lot of expectation around what the ANC does with this January 8 statement after what was a difficult 2024 election for them. Perhaps talk us through, within the Mail and Guardian, what some of those discussions look like around how we tell this story in 2025.
Well, I'll speak from the perspective of being an analyst for Africa-Asia Dialogues, which is what I do all the time and every day. I think Jacob Zuma tried to spoil the party on January the 8th by coming up with that story of being wanted to be reinstated. You're correct when you say the ANC January the 8th statement seeks to set an agenda. But if the 6 priorities that President Cyril Ramaphosa mentioned are in that particular order, then I'm worried. The prioritization of the renewal of the ANC, for me, I think is a waste of time. I think the ANC tends to emphasize this unity and renewal. It's actually very good for democracy to be disunited, because it introduces this vibrant debate that is continuing to take place within the ANC. And I think if the ANC was really united, I don't think we'll be talking 113 years today.
Yeah, but was it a strong story that the ANC spoke of itself in this January 8 statement? And of course, there's been a lot of question around even the venue that was used, right? That stadium in Khayelitsha, some other parties even coming out and saying, well, they're unable to fill some of the biggest stadiums and that's why they had to go to Khayelitsha. But what do you make of that very discussion around if they look as like a strong ANC in 2025?
I think it was a good choice to go to Khayelitsha. I think the DA is playing the political game. I don't think it was that important for the ANC to have a different stadium. I think the Khayelitsha was very appropriate. The fact that they walked around in different townships in the Western Cape, emphasizing the importance and significance of the ANC and why the people of the Western Cape must vote for the ANC come 2026 local elections. I think it was key. And I think the fact that they also unleashed the senior leadership of the ANC to go to different locations within the Western Cape, particularly black communities, was a sign of strength within the ANC. Yes, there were certain incidences which indicated ANC not being popular anymore, but I think those were just here. Very few of them actually occurred, but by and large, I think the ANC is still very strong.
Well, those incidents, I think, stand out because obviously, especially with the coverage of it, there's the moments that people think about, well, just how in touch are they really? And Sanet, perhaps this is where I bring you in. There's been some talk about the yacht that was, traveling and taking the SG of the ANC, for instance, to Robben Island in the run-up to the 113th anniversary. And the story that the ANC told the country about who it is in 2025, how do you interpret it?
I think that for the largest part, I think we can agree that the ANC was a bit out of touch, or that moment highlighted how out of touch they actually are with reality. I think that choosing Khayelitsha was obviously something that they wanted to do. As you rightfully mentioned, it is a smaller venue, so it's easier to fill. And I think that given the fact that the demographics in Cape Town don't necessarily look favorable, I mean, you have your Camps Bay, you have the Constantias and so on. So I don't think that those would have been suitable venues. So it made sense that you would either choose Khayelitsha or Langa, because again, a venue like somewhere in Mitchell's Plain may have not worked. But I also think that this use of this like yacht, if you want to, basically highlighted something that despite the fact that they speak about wanting to reduce inequality, wanting to ensure that everybody has different or equal opportunities, I don't necessarily think that it translated. And as you rightfully mentioned, a lot of the people's focus is now on that particular yacht and what it symbolizes, as opposed to what the ANC actually sought to achieve by having this event during this weekend at Khayelitsha.
Yeah, because it speaks to whether or not people, and now I'm talking about South Africans, ANC members, listen to the message, right? The president of the party, for instance, talking in Senate, I'll stay with you for a moment on this one, talking about introducing an accountability framework. And it's important wording, but do people believe it? As an analyst, do you believe it?
I don't think that people believe it. I think that for a number of years, the ANC has managed to continue with its populist rhetoric. And I think that they're saying all of the things that they think people want to hear. I think if there was an element of accountability, I think that we would have seen the capacitation of the NPA. I think then they would have more resources to actually go forth with those state capture investigations. There are a lot of allegations and fraud and corruption. I think that we would have obviously seen more action in terms of that. There are a number of municipalities that have had fruitless and wasteful expenditures. Each year we see the Auditor General releasing those statements, but we don't necessarily see accountability taking place in terms of those different municipalities. So I think when you talk about having an accountability framework, it needs to be beyond just creating more legislation, because South Africa has excellent legislation. Our biggest problem has always been implementation. And I think that the ANC is known to come up with legislation that it doesn't necessarily execute. And I think in 2025, people are beyond listening to these frameworks. I think they are tired of seeing the 5-point and 8-point plans and all sorts of things. And I think they actually just want more action. And I think that that's where the ANC is lacking.
Yeah, because there is the question, Thembisa, around whether or not we run a risk of hearing repetitive sort of January 8 statements, questions around, well, what differentiates this from, for instance, some of the messaging that you'd hear in a State of the Nation address. The issues around water scarcity, gender-based violence are going to come up. The issues around needing to tackle youth unemployment, obviously expected to come up in a January 8 statement, as they would, for instance, in a SONA. What was missing?
Well, there was no wow moment for me during this statement. I think the president should have emphasized, particularly spend more time on youth unemployment, because it's a big issue in this country. And it could just trigger other instabilities. And he didn't speak much on that. He did give us broad strokes on what the ANC should do. And this is the president of the country telling the ANC what was going to be doing. At some point, you think that there were two different people speaking. But there was no wow moment for me. I think the emphasis on factionalism of the ANC is not a priority for us as South Africans. And the renewal of the ANC is not urgent for us as South Africans who want to see service delivery, which I think is very urgent and key to many people to prioritize. That's why I've said, if those priorities were in that particular order that the president mentioned, then I'm worried, because the priority number one was renewal of the ANC, which I'm not quite sure whether South Africans are really interested in the renewal of the ANC.
Yeah, I'm interested also in I suppose, some of the rumblings within the Tripartite Alliance and how they've played out in this 113th anniversary. I mean, prior to it, the SACP having come out and said that in next year's elections, they'll be running individually. At this anniversary, though, COSATU coming out and seemingly, staying in line and making it quite clear that they will be supporting the ANC. And the same message coming from Senko. So does that leave the SACP's approach here, Thembisa, null and void?
I think so. I think the SACP is biting more than it can chew. There's an element of self-importance. I'm not quite sure whether they can really have a standalone policy, standalone compete for elections. They will never be able to make it without the ANC. I'm not even sure whether South Africans even know what the SACP stands for. So it's very ambitious. And I think it's going to be just a failed project. But at the same time, we cannot write off the possibility that perhaps this is a strategy of the Tripartite Alliance to have a SACP standing alone for these elections with an intention that if there is a widespread disgruntlement against the ANC, people might just move to the SACP, which is still going to further the same kind of position and policies of the ANC.
Yeah, Sanet, what do you make of that very debate? Kosatu and Sanko saying, well, we're continuing to support the ANC, the SACP at the 113th anniversary, essentially coming out and saying, well, we need to have a calmer discussion as these between ourselves as the SACP and the ANC. Is there great future prospects for the SACP here, or have we had this discussion before?
I think that for a number of years, the SACP has been quite vocal about the unhappiness that it has, in that it feels or believes that it benefits less from the Tripartite alliance, which I don't necessarily think is accurate. If you look at some of the ministers and some of the people holding very high government positions, those tend to also be quite senior leaders within the SACP. But I also don't think that the ANC can afford another breakaway. If it is a strategy by the Tripartite alliance, as the former colleague mentioned, then I think it would be quite bright on their side to try and catch those votes and then move back into the Tripartite alliance. But I think that if it's not a strategy, you can't afford a further breakaway. I mean, there was the breakaway of members to join COPE, then we had members leaving to join the EFF. Now we've had members leaving to join MK. And if you have the SACP also leaving, then you have even more fragmentation. And it's just a matter of time before you have the party splintering into all sorts of smaller parties. So that's not necessarily something that you would want. But what I found quite interesting about the importance, or them emphasizing the importance of the SACP, is that the statement basically suggested that the Tripartite alliance was still important, that it was intact. So I think it would be interesting for them to actually highlight whether there were discussions that were had, which were not necessarily shared with the public, and what those would mean. But I think moving forward, it would be best, or in the best interest of not only the Tripartite alliance, but also the ANC, for them to remain together, for them to actually continue working together, and for them to try and get those votes from the, if you wish, for lack of better wording, the left side of the political spectrum, so that they actually can grow and develop as a collective.
Yeah, let's look at other ones. And you've already touched on the EFF, Sanet, and perhaps that's where I'll go, right? A big talking point this week has been the resignation of senior leader Mbuyiseni Ndlozi as an MP, also that of Yazini Tekiana as a member of, both of them as members of parliament for the EFF. A lot of questions around what does that mean for their relationship. And Sanet, I'll stay with this, for their relationship within the EFF. I mean, the statement from the EFF, for instance, saying the EFF wishes the fighters well in their future endeavors, very vague as to what that says about where they're going. What do you make of it?
I think that for the longest time, there's been a lot of speculation about whether Dr. Ndlozi would be leaving the EFF. And what was quite interesting is, since the start of these rumors, that he actually hasn't been public or responding to any of it. And I think that obviously his barment from the EFF rally or the EFF engagement that took place in the latter half of last year, we would have noted that that possibly suggested that he wasn't going to continue with the political party. But it also suggests that he could have been pushed out of the party, because there were statements where the leader of the EFF was quoted saying that those who were supposed to be here are here, which suggests that he was not supposed to be here, and maybe he just respected the fact that the political party was no longer in need of his services or of him as a member. And I think that possibly on the horizon, I think that he has quite a number of prospects that he could look forward to. But I definitely think that he was a threat to Julius Malema. He is quite charismatic. I think that he resonates with a lot of what the youth wants and what the youth aspires to. But this also points towards a possibility of the EFF not necessarily being open to new ideas, new leadership, and possibly the challenging of the trajectory of the political party.
Yeah. Can we reflect on just the popularity of Mbuyiseni Ndlozi and what he's able to attract, how you measure, how the electorate sees him, and what... I mean, a lot of people have been throwing the bones as to what the future could look like for Dr. Ndlozi. What do you see, Thembisa?
Well, I hope he's listening. I think he should pursue academia, stay away from politics for a while, still young. There's a lot that he can do. But if you jump into another, or joining another political party, particularly the MK, which I think won't last beyond Jacob Zuma, you might just have to jump again to another political party. So my advice, and I think the position that he should take, is to pursue a different career outside politics. And he will be much more effective, by the way. You'll have a much more freedom and space to communicate and contribute towards the development of this country. So politics is not necessarily the only platform that people can make their contributions. And a person like him, I think it can really, really be beneficial if he joins academic work and start doing some proper, academic work in one of the universities.
I must say that's an interesting perspective, because I've heard quite a few perspectives around which direction we could possibly see Ndlozi go, depending on what he decides to do next. And I think, obviously, sometimes we work off the assumption that some that have left the EFF have gone towards the MK party. But there are other political parties. I mean, what would Ndlozi perhaps look like in a DA or in an ANC, for instance?
Well, it will be effective. He's quite a sharp politician and a sharp individual. But again, I insist that I don't think politics is a space for him, at least not yet. He can go and explore other possibilities, continue to contribute towards South Africa. There are a lot of spaces that require a skill of that he possesses at the moment, and he might just be more effective than going into joining political party. Of course, it's going to be a loss for politics in this country, because he's one of the cool-headed, sane, smart individuals. So it will be a loss for the political sphere. However, I think it can make a serious contribution elsewhere.
Yeah, Sanet, I see you smiling. Are you seeing any sort of a bomb throwing there on your side?
I think as an academic, I may be biased in this regard, but I do agree. I think he would make an excellent academic. One of the great things about academia is that it actually allows you to share your knowledge and share your ideas, and it is a great space for creatives, and I think that's something that he is. But I also think that in terms of different NGOs and think tanks, I also think that he would be quite excellent there. We know that he is legislatively very strong, that he is able to unpack very complex things. And I think that for the longest part, he basically contributed quite a lot to the EFF. And I don't necessarily think that that would be a waste, but I do think that maybe a cool-off period from politics would be beneficial to him. And I do think that he has a lot of skill sets that would be quite beneficial to different government departments, different NGOs, think tanks again, and hopefully academia.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to other parties, because the Democratic Alliance also getting us talking a little bit this week with somewhat of what you call a tug of war between the DA and Action SA, Thembisa. And we saw Dereline James, for instance, of Action SA get the conversation really rolling in Parliament, asking the Agriculture Minister around his official vehicles being fitted with blue lights. And then there's reports of the Federal Chair, Khayelitsha, having said in a media interview that DA ministers simply do not use blue lights. So, I mean, what do you make of that very issue? The Democratic Alliance has come out and said, wow, they inherited those vehicles and inherited that infrastructure, and that those lights have not been used. I found it interesting that this was a talking point to begin with.
Well, chicken have come home to roost, isn't it? These are the people who have been criticizing other politicians, particularly the ANC officials, for using blue lights. And this is the same man who was proud of driving a Corolla. Alas, he's not only driving a Corolla, he's got a contingent of blue lights and security guards that accompany him wherever he goes. So it's hypocrisy. And I don't think they can spin themselves out of this. They'll have to do much more than just giving us that rhetoric that we've had from the DA last week.
Well, what we heard was that the cars were inherited and very little was spent here.
Convenient, isn't it? You can as well say, no, you're not interested, because you are committed to saving the government money. You're committed to make sure that you get rid of the extravagance of the blue lights, as you've been criticizing all the years. So that's not going to fly with the South African constituency, the fact that you've just inherited an extravagant, bloated budget on blue lights, and you decided to take it, notwithstanding that you are the one who has been screaming and shouting over the years about this unnecessary expenditure.
Yeah, Willie Okamp, Sanet said, we all inherited the vehicles. They're equipped with blue lights. DA ministers, though, have made it clear that the blue lights in their official vehicles will not be used under any circumstances. You believe that?
I don't believe it. One of the easiest things to do is, if you are inheriting something, there's always something else. For example, let's say you do have a fleet of vehicles. Amongst those vehicles would be a more simplistic vehicle. So you don't necessarily have to take what you are getting. You can ask, what are my alternatives? And I think that in the moment, it is easy for you to say you won't do it. But again, you don't know what's going to happen. And I think that when they do utilize it, I think we'll eventually hear another excuse, and it would most probably be something to do with the safety of the minister, or it would have to do something with national security, or it was an emergency of some sort. So I think it's something that is quite convenient and something you can wiggle yourself out of.
Yeah, and just as we wrap up, of course, and I'm going to throw the last question at you, Thembisa, because you're here in studio with us. I think a lot of reflection around, as we start the year, what relationships look like between the various political parties. I think about Jordan Hill-Lewis coming out publicly and talking about the stadia, a fracas in the Western Cape about whether or not the ANC had booked a stadium in advance. And I wondered if it said something about relations between the two parties and if there's a concern going into 2025 around the stability of GNU. Final thoughts.
Well, I think the campaign has already started for local elections, and that's what the DA started doing last week, and that's what it's all about. I think the GNU is going to survive. There is a will amongst all the parties that this is an important project for South Africa to counter the counter-revolutionaries in inverted commas. So the GNU, I don't think is going to be impacted, but you can regard the statement of DA last week as the beginning of the campaigning for 2026 local elections.
All right. Well, we wish you a great year ahead, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Thembisa Fakude, the Senior Research Fellow for Africa-Asia Dialogues, and he's also Director at the Mail and Guardian newspaper. And thanks as well to Sanet Madonsela-Solomon, who is a political analyst, speaking to us this evening.